Welcome back. Today I'm continuing the process to convert my 1981 DeLorean into an electric vehicle. And on today's episode, I'm going to be doing all of the work necessary to get the 12-volt wiring harness working and the high voltage system working, at least well enough that we can get the motor spinning for the very first time. To catch you up quickly, I'm taking the entire drivetrain out of a Chevy Bolt, the electric motor, the inverter, the charger, the batteries, everything, and swapping them into a DeLorean. This is Project Lightning. This is the current state of the 12-volt wiring. This is, oof. Yeah, I think I messed up. When I had it all on the floor, and then I moved it into the car, I just kind of rolled it up on a cart and then rolled it into the car. And I was hoping that would keep everything kind of in the same spot. It didn't. So now I'm trying to figure out exactly where this rat's nest of wires goes. You can see, though, I have mocked up where the center console screen and the instrument cluster screen are going to go. I also have the little shift knob in there. There's just a big bundle. I'm trying to organize it so like this is the anti-lock brakes in this little pile, and there's some random little modules hanging around. All of the rear taillights, and there's some modules that go along with it. Those are back here. Ooh, all right, so I've made a bunch of progress, even though it still looks like an insane mess here. This is the main fuse panel from the Chevy Bolt, and it's gonna live in this area. And then in here is the battery. I've done a lot of work wiring up the battery, and I put a switch on it there. I've got both the positive lead and negative. The chassis of the car is now grounded, and then I've also got the positive coming out here, powering the fuse box, and then this is this little janky ground here. I've just got all of these little plugs, alligator clips hooked up so that the grounds are, at least most of them, I think I got most of them, are plugged in. And all of the modules should be plugged in that are required for the 12-volt system. This is just a complete mess over here, but I've tried to keep it organized with certain things going in certain areas, but they're just kind of hanging there. I will clean this up at a further date. The heart of everything is right here. This is the body control module. So this is literally the first time I'm going to hit the switch, and we're going to see what happens. Nothing. Okay. Well, that was a good try. All right, so I'm back just a few minutes later, and I think I've figured out what the problem is. I had forgot to plug in this cable. This cable goes from the battery up to the front, and it powers the front fuse box. So that seems like it's probably a good reason why none of this stuff would power on. So let's back up. So let's give it a go. Oh, there we go. Okay, so I've already seen some light, and it looked like it just came on for half a second, and then went away. I'm gonna hit the power button. Okay, there we go. No remote detected. That's kind of expected. Okay, so this is good. This looks like a complete disaster, but it is, working in the car. The goal here is just to get this working enough that I can spin the motor. And then I'll worry about this at a later date. So I've made a bunch of progress. Let me show you what's going on. First, I've got the center console thing kind of zip tied there so it doesn't keep falling down. I've got the instrument cluster right in the middle. The reason I don't have it sitting above the steering wheel is because the wires aren't long enough and I cannot be bothered. Because the wiring under here was so terrible, I thought it would be best to just hide it. The other big thing is I now have wiring that actually goes back to the back of the car. One of those is this one that I've labeled E. This is the harness that connects the main harness, which is like under here, and connects it back to the engine harness, or the engine bay harness. These. So here at the back, I now have the engine bay wiring harness in place. And so I've actually got the transmission plugged in. So all that is good to go. And if I hit the unlock button, you can see that all of the taillights actually come on over there. So all that is working. So now let's go sit in the car. You can see that I have a warning there that says shift to park. Yeah, it's because I don't have all of the high voltage stuff plugged in, so that doesn't work. I don't have long enough cables to actually reach the brake pedal sensor and the accelerator. So what I've done is I've pulled the two sensors out. So this is my brake sensor, and that over there is the accelerator. I don't need that yet, but it's there. I've also mocked up the shifter knob, and so I've just got it zip tied into place. So that way I can actually move around a little bit. Okay, so I've hit the brake and then the power button, and it'll say initializing, wait to shift. And I'm assuming that is again saying that, well, partially because I think this resets every time I unplug or turn off the power, it completely resets. So yeah, so there we go. We're now seeing some errors, service, power steering, drive with care, all that kind of stuff. It is now saying a warning message there. I can play music. It's just static because the antenna's not plugged in, but it is working, so I've got speakers there. So anyway, this is in a good place now. So the next thing on my list is I need the batteries. So I'm going to start working on that now. I installed the battery packs in a prior video, so I'm skipping that, but here I am installing the BMS wiring and the main high voltage wires through the central tunnel of the car. It's going to be really helpful to understand what's going on if I can explain to you the wiring diagram of the high voltage system. So at a high level, in the back of the car, I have a big battery pack. And in the front of the car, I also have a big battery pack. That front battery pack is actually split up into two, and there is a high voltage wire that connects those two together so that it acts like one back. Then the front pack and the rear pack are connected together with a high voltage cable that also goes through the manual service disconnect. I'm going to do some functional checks at the front battery pack. That's 27.9 volts. The manual service disconnect is shut off right now, and so the voltage should come to this wire, but not all the way over to this wire. So here and here should be 0 volts, correct. Here and here should be 0 volts, correct. And here is 167.64 volts, which is half the pack voltage, so that does make sense. Then next up is this wire, which is heading to the back of the car, but there's nothing on it. There's nothing plugged in. Okay, there we go. So at this point, this battery pack is completely installed. Okay, so this is kind of a big deal right now. I'm just about to plug the entire battery pack together for the first time. Before I do that, I'm gonna make sure I don't kill myself. So I've got my multimeter here. I'm gonna set it on volts, DC, and then I'm going to disconnect. So this here is the line that goes up to the front battery pack. Now, right now, this is not live, should not be live, because the manual service disconnect right here is not in it. And so this is where our fuse is, and it's also where, like basically this is a big bus bar in here. And so this disconnects the pack. So if you remove this, you don't have any pack voltage. So the first thing I'm going to do is confirm that our manual service disconnect is working as intended. So I'm going to pull this here, and this is set to DC volts. And if I test this right now, let me prop this up for you. And if I test this right now, it should say 0 volts. Doesn't matter which one I connect here, that one and that one. And I'm getting 0 volts, 0.003 volts, which is just a little bit of floating voltage on it, totally okay, all right? So now I'm going to go up to the front of the car, put the manual service disconnect in, and then we'll come back and test this again. So far, so good. I did not hear any noises. I do not see any smoke rising from anywhere. So then this should give us, 167.62 volts. So same voltage as we got over there. So now I'm going to disconnect that. And hey, let's confirm, just because that this has now gone back to 0 volts. It has. Then let me take this off of here. These things take an insane amount of force to remove. I wish they were a little bit more of a nice and slippy slide fit, but once the pack is complete and it actually has the terminals in there, this thing is rough to get off. Okay, so now let's check the voltage here. And again, this should also be 0 volts because there's no pack, like there's nothing that's going on here. So there we go, 0 volts. This cable here, which is our full ground connector, it just literally goes right here, so it doesn't go anywhere. However, I can check the voltage between this, which is our pack, the rear battery pack, negative voltage, and I can actually get the main positive of the whole pack. So I can test between those two items because I've removed the cabling here. So let me go ahead and put that there. And then again, if I do this lower one, I get nothing. And if I do this upper one, I get 167.67 volts. So that's good because that means that my packs, the front pack and the rear pack, are basically the same voltage, 167. So now so the front pack is disconnected, the service disconnect is there. Let me go ahead and plug this in. I do love on these Anderson connectors that they are keyed. So not only do, like, a red connector only goes into another red connector, but they are also, the positive will only connect to positive and negative only to negative. So you don't have to worry about that kind of thing. So let me plug this in. Okay, so as expected, nothing terrible happened. And yeah, so still, I should not have any voltage here on the main voltage. Okay, so right there to there, 0. However, once I put the service disconnect in there, this should work. Okay, again, no loud noises, no fire, no sparks, no smoke. $335.3 volts. So that is our pack voltage, our complete pack voltage for the completed battery pack. So that's fantastic. So now let me hit that manual service disconnect again, turn it off, and then we need to hook up the BMS because we are ready. The pack's done. We're ready to actually hook up the BMS. And then at that point, we can also jump in the car and confirm that the BMS is working. I have not hooked up the motor yet. You might have noticed sitting here, I've got the single power inverter module also known as the motor controller or the motor inverter. It is sitting here. I wanted to make sure that the cables and things were going to reach, so it's not actually plugged in and doing anything yet, but that's going to be next up once we confirm that the BMS is working. Okay, let's keep going. Hey there. So it's been 3 days since everything was ready to go with the BMS. The reason it's been that long is because I've been working trying to get the electronics in the car up and running, and so far I have not had any luck. So this is part of my scan tool. You can see the other end is down here connected to the onboard diagnostics port in the car. I can use this scanner to scan all of the modules, at least that's the idea. And when I originally purchased the car, I hooked up the scanner, was able to scan absolutely everything, confirm no codes. I actually had to fix some codes, if you remember, back in a previous episode, but everything was perfect. Well, now when I went to plug everything in, I found out that most of the modules could not be scanned. They were not responding. And then the few modules that I could connect to, for example, the main BCM body control module, that could communicate, like I could communicate with it, but it could not communicate with anything else as well. And so this has started a 3-day long, many hour trip of diagnosing what's going wrong. Starting from the point where basically I can't communicate with any of the modules and the body control module can't communicate with the modules, where do I go? The first thing I tried was going through a list of the modules to try and find if they were communicating over the same bus. And it turns out they were. So all of these devices are on something called the high-speed CAN bus number 1. And so all of the failures were happening on that bus. Although I think that there's also other CAN buses that have other modules on them, but as far as I can tell, every module on CAN bus 1 just doesn't communicate. So going from there, I started trying to find out why wouldn't they be able to communicate. So I pulled up the data sheet showing the pin out for the onboard diagnostics port. And I also looked up some videos on how to diagnose CAN bus issues. And what I found out is that a CAN bus is basically like a long pair of wires. And at the ends of those wires, there are terminating resistors of 120 ohms each. And any place then, if you were to probe on any place on that pair of wires, you would see 60 ohms of resistance because there's two 120 ohm resistors in parallel, 60 ohms. What I found when I probed on this CAN bus number 1 on the OBD port was that it was not 60 ohms, it was 120 ohms. That leads me down the path of saying, okay, my CAN bus is broken, it's disconnected, and so I'm only seeing one end and I'm not seeing the other end. And why is that? It's probably helpful to know how a CAN bus is supposed to work and also how a CAN bus works in practice for this. So in principle, it's a line with 2 resistors on the end, but in practice, that is not how it's actually hooked up, I've found. How it's actually hooked up is that each device, so for example, this here is a module and it has a connector on it. And it doesn't just have a CAN bus high and low signal going into it. It has 2 CAN bus highs and 2 CAN bus lows. So what happens is the CAN bus is literally cut for every device, and then the device is responsible for having a bridge inside of the module that connects those 2 together, as well as connecting onto them to communicate for itself. I didn't know that. Essentially what that means is that it doesn't act more like a single bar that things are attached onto. It acts more like a daisy chain of things. In other words, let's say you've got 4 devices on your bus. It is not a parallel string so that if any of these is removed, everyone else can still communicate. A daisy chain works because A connects to B connects to C connects to D. And if any of these links are broken in the middle, it means that the entire bus is broken. So what that means is that if there are any devices, any modules that are in this chain not there, then the whole thing is broken. And so there were some that I didn't have plugged in. Okay, so at the rear of the car, I have an AC compressor, but I'm not going to have AC for quite a long time. And so I didn't have it plugged in. And so because of that, it was broken. But that's not all. I also found that I have other devices that are not plugged in. So my power steering motor, the cable is over here in this mess of wires, and it's just not long enough to connect over to the power steering motor yet. At some point, I will get around to extending that line and plugging it in, but for now, it's disconnected. Well, the CAN bus goes through that too. So what I've had to do is bridge those connectors to basically add a little jumper wire so that the CAN bus is not broken. But still, that wasn't it. So I looked around at every single module. Every module right now is plugged in. I've got the AC compressor plugged in at the back. I've got a jumper wire on the power steering motor, and still I cannot communicate with everything. So now I've had to go through this rabbit hole of looking up all of the wiring diagrams for the CAN bus to try and figure out what order everything is on this CAN bus, so I can try and figure out where the break is. I found that the 2019 Chevy Bolt that I have does not have a front-facing camera module, but it's an option in other vehicles. And that option uses the CAN bus. And I didn't think that that would matter, but it does. So I had not plugged in the headliner circuit, and the headliner circuit itself has a bridge for the CAN bus. So now what I am going to do is try and go through this mess of wires and actually find the headliner harness connector, wherever it is, somewhere I haven't been able to find it. Once I find that, I will plug in. It's literally just a harness that has a loop in it. And hopefully that brings a conclusion to these last 3 days of diagnosing this problem. So let's see if I can do that. I plugged the harness in. It's just one connector plug over there. I plugged it in, I turned the car on, and now, I'm not sure if you can see, but over there, there is a red park indicator on the shift knob, which has never happened before. So that is a good sign, at least a sign of something different. I'm now going to go into Vehicle Diagnostics, Vehicle DTC Information, and we're going to scan this and see what actually shows up. Okay, this is great. It's doing it, it's working. So it is now able to communicate to the engine control module, the chassis control module, the hybrid EV powertrain control module 1 and 2, electronic brake control modules. It's actually communicating with everything. It can't communicate to the power steering control module, which is makes sense because it's not plugged in. All of these other ones, it's connected to. Passenger presence module, no. Video processing unit, no. Yes, almost everything is on here. This is fantastic. And the main one, the battery energy control module. I plugged the BMS in under the car. So now I'm going to go under here to module diagnostics, and I'm going to connect to the battery energy control module. And let's do data display. And let's do battery energy control module data. I'm going to look at voltage data. Oh, look at this. You can't see this, but it's beautiful. This is showing all of the battery pack voltages, or sorry, battery cell voltages, and they are all the same. They're all 3.49, 3.50, 3.49, everything is looking really good there. I'm just going to confirm that all of the, there's 3 pages of them. I'm just going to go through all of them really quickly. Oh, man, who would have thought that it was just the stupid headliner harness that was preventing all of this from working? Well, actually, I guess that's not quite true. Even without the headliner harness in there, if I would have put the headliner harness in, it still wouldn't have run because the AC compressor wasn't there and the power steering wasn't overridden, but tracking down the headliner harness was a bigger pain than all of those other things. All right, it's now been another couple days since the last little video segment I did, and really I'm just doing this to express my utter frustration at how things are going right now. I've basically spent the last 2 or 3 days since that last video and since the live stream really trying to get the car motor to spin, and it hasn't happened yet. And so the reason I haven't been able to get the motor to spin is because I haven't been able to get the high voltage contactors to click closed to give high voltage to the rest of the car. I have spent hours and hours adding additional components. I've got the tail lights and brake lights. I put the latches for the hood and the hatchback. I hooked up the AC compressor on the floor and ran all the wires to it. I got the high and low sensors for the AC compressor or AC system. I've just been doing everything that I can think of, all of the little components to try and get the car to turn on successfully, and it has not. Now, I have made some progress. I can put the car into neutral and then take it out of neutral, and a lot of the errors that I was getting initially, I had about 65 trouble codes when I first turned the car on, and that is now down to about 40 trouble codes. Ooh, look at all these things plugged in. Just hanging off the car. This is Bill from the editing booth in the future. I had some issues with sound recording in this next clip, so I'm going to narrate over top of it. While trying to figure out how to get the motor spinning, I found people online saying that the charger circuit had to be working. You can see here that I've plugged in all the high voltage modules and the charge port. This was the first attempt to get the car to charge, and it worked, but I still couldn't enable high voltage to the rest of the car or to the motor. It took me another week to get the high voltage system enabled, and it all comes down to a safety feature in the BMS that checks for high voltage isolation faults. The high voltage battery is not supposed to be connected to either ground or the 12-volt battery. It is completely isolated, which I verified using my multimeter. My multimeter does this test by using an internal resistor, which I believe is 10 kilo ohm. And what I didn't realize is that the BMS is sensitive enough that it will identify the multimeter connection itself as a system isolation fault. And when it detects that fault, it throws a special error code that isn't cleared unless you use the code scanner to run a clear, secure, high voltage DTC function. Literally, as soon as I ran that function, I heard the contactors click closed and was able to put the car into drive and spin the motor. Here's what it looked like. Look at that. I know that noise is annoying, but the motor is spinning. You can also hear oil, which I assume is the oil from the inside of the motor transmission. Oh, this is amazing. And there you have it. The electric motor is spinning for the very first time in the DeLorean. Coming up next, I've got to get our brakes working, our steering working. I've got to get the high voltage components solidly mounted so that we can take this car around the block for the very first time. So if this seems like a fun project, you won't want to miss out on the next episode. So please show me that you're interested and give me your support by subscribing. This is Project Lightning.